It's so much more empowering if you can do something that's difficult rather than something that's easy. And the same thing for pleasure. People tend to be genetically wired to be able to attach more significance to the negatives than to the positives. Uh, and so it does take training the mind to focus on what's good. And what you'll find is that there are more good things that are happening than bad things, but the bad things tend to overshadow the good things. And so it is a question of focus.
Kind of life wisdom you have for the group?
Judy, let's move on.
Okay. See how well I knew my dad?
No, but this is, I think one of the points of cognitive therapy is to be humanistic and optimistic, and to like other people, connect with other people, but also be optimistic in your own life. And if you are, you're going to have a much happier life than otherwise. So that's what I would say is the secret. So.
And if people are not necessarily born with an optimistic bent, is optimism something you think that can be learned?
Yeah, and you can learn optimism by deciding that you're going to look at the positive side of things, because many things in life, perhaps most things, have either a positive or a negative, and you can look at the negative, or you can focus on the positive element. And I noticed that in myself. No matter what happens, it seems I always make a virtue of it. Like if I want to go outside and get a lot of sunshine, and it starts to rain, then I think, oh, that's great. Now I can go indoors and work on a paper. Or if somebody doesn't answer a phone call, then I think, well, that's good because probably he or she is too busy, and that's a good reason for them not. So I try to make a virtue of adversity, even when other people might consider this adverse. So it's one way.
You know, and I've seen this really show up in your work in recent years when you've talked about the importance of focus.
Right.
Want to say, talk for a minute about that?
You can. It depends in life on what you focus on. For example, if I was going to have a surgical operation, and somebody said, you know, there's a 10% probability that you're going to die, or I would focus on, well, there's a 90% probability that I'm going to get over this, and I'll be well and healthy and happy. So it's a question as to what you focus on. And people who are depressed, of course, tend to focus on the negative. And so part of our therapy consists of what we call the mastery and pleasure principle, which is focusing on the things that you have accomplished, that you're accomplishing now, even though they are very difficult. And particularly if they're difficult, it's so much more empowering if you can do something that's difficult rather than something that's easy. And the same thing for pleasure. People tend to be genetically wired to be able to attach more significance to the negatives than to the positives. And so it does take training the mind to focus on what's good. And what you'll find is that there are more good things that are happening than bad things, but the bad things tend to overshadow the good things. And so it is a question of focus. So, for example, one of my patients came in and he said, "Doctor, I'm so depressed, I think I want to kill myself." And I said, "Why is that?" And he says, "Well, I'm just a total failure." And I said, "What way are you a total failure?" And he said, "Well, I'm a failure as a husband, as a parent, as a business person, as a homekeeper, as a home supporter." and so on. So I could have, at that level, just talked about his sense of helplessness and failure. But I wanted to get more information. So instead of addressing helplessness, which seems to be across the board there, or the sense of failure, or the sense of frustration, I started taking each of these components in order, keeping in mind that the overall meaning of what he said did have to do with failure, right? It's pretty clear that his belief, I am a failure, had just grabbed hold of him and now was playing out in every aspect of his life. So I asked, well, first of all, you said you're a failure as a husband. So what's happened recently that gave you that thought? He says, well, when my wife went off for work today, she didn't say goodbye. And I said, well, so what does that mean to you? And he says, well, it means she doesn't love me. I said, why is that? She said, because she always says goodbye, but now she must be ticked off and she doesn't love me, and somehow, I don't know what, but there's something about me that turns her off. So I said, okay. So then I kept going on. So I said, now what makes you think that you're a failure as a father? And he says, well, because the kids all were fighting this morning. So I said, okay. And I said, what makes you think that you're a failure as a businessman and a provider? And he said, because I just looked at the budget report, and we're going to go in debt for the next 3 months. And then finally, I said, well, what about your failure as a homekeeper? And he said, well, the roof is caving in the house. So here we could have just dealt with the common denominator. The meaning is he's a failure in each of these things, and could have talked about the failure. But then I broke it up into each compartment. And this is what we wouldn't have done as a psychoanalyst. Psychoanalyst, we would have looked for an unconscious meaning, or might be for the conscious meaning. But we break this up into the different pieces. So I then asked him, what about your wife running off? I said, do you remember anything that happened prior to her running off? And he said, well, she was very rushed at breakfast. And I said, yeah, do you remember any conversation that you had? And he said, well, I guess she told me she had a very important meeting coming up. And I said, oh. And what else did she say? And she said, she was late for the meeting. And I said, oh. Well, is it possible that the reason she rushed off without saying goodbye was that she was in a hurry? And he says, that does make sense. So then I asked him, what about your teenagers fighting all the time? And he said, yeah, it's terrible. I just can't seem to control them. And I said, well, what about the other kids in the neighborhood? Are they all very quiet and they all get along? And he said, yeah, I guess teenagers do fight. And then I asked him, what about the business? He says, well, we're going to run a deficit next year, or next semester. And I said, but I know you're in the clothing business, and I understand you run through cycles. And you run through the cycle where you're making more money than you're spending, and then you run through another cycle where you're spending more money, you're manufacturing the dresses, and then you make up for it the next trimester when you start selling the dress. He said, yeah, I guess you're right. So then I said, well, now what about the roof caving in? And he says, well, the roof was leaking. And I said, yes. And he says, well, it's caving in. So I said, well, what do people do when the roof is leaking? And he says, well, I don't know. I said, well, what did you do in the past when you had problems with the roof? He said, oh, I called the roofer. So I said, well, isn't that a job for the roofer? And he said, yeah, you might be right.
I've heard that in CBT dismantling studies, and I think this may have been the behavioral activation versus cognitive therapy studies, I'm not sure. It is not the cognitive restructuring that has significant impact. What is your take on this?
So, got to go back to formulation. You have to formulate the case, and oftentimes you're helped by the theoretical formulation of that particular disorder. And so let's say it's a depressed case, and he's severely depressed. You don't have him fill out a thought record, do you? If the person's severely depressed, to use what I described in my 1980 book as behavioral activation, you give the patient a schedule. You work with the patient collaboratively in preparing a schedule, and then you try to engage the patient in following. So engagement is very important. You try to engage the patient in trying to follow through. Now, if they're severely depressed, they're going to think that that's not going to do them any good. And you might even start the behavioral activation right in the office. There's one time I was asked to see a patient over at the VA, and he'd been in bed for months, maybe years, and they just couldn't get him going. And he was really hopeless. That was the whole thing. And if anybody tried to get him to do something, he would just kind of give up on it. And so I then asked him a question. I said, what do you think, what would you think if I told you that if you followed a few simple instructions that you'd be able to get out of bed and you'd be able to play ping pong with the other patients and so on? And he said, I think you're crazy. And so I said, would you like to test that out? And he said, test what out? I said, whether I'm crazy or not. Well, that really got to him, and that intrigued him. So then what I did with him is I said, why don't you sit at the edge of the bed and try to put your 2 feet down? And he said, well, okay, I don't know what good it's going to do. I said, what? You agreed that you're going to test out whether I'm crazy or not. So I said, okay. And then I said, will you try standing up? And he said, if I stand up, I'll fall. And I said, but that's okay. I'm going to hold you. So then I held him, and then he took a few steps, and he took a few steps more, and then he got tired, and he came back. And I said, well, what did the experiments show you? And he said, oh, I don't know. What was it supposed to show? I said, whether I was crazy or not. He says, well, maybe you're just a little psychotic, but not totally crazy. But anyhow, so this demonstrated, so I started really right in the session. This then demonstrated to the rest of the ward personnel what they could do with him. And it's true, a week later I came back and he was indeed playing ping pong with the other. So anyhow, severe patients, you want to use activity scheduling. Moderate patients, you can use the thought record with them. You can use a whole lot of other things with them. Now, let's just say they don't respond, though, to the thought record. Well, there's a whole approach that you can use, which is similar to what I've been talking about with the schizophrenic patients, and that is to get them invested in something outside themselves. And this is particularly true of the depressed patients who are ruminators. If they're ruminators, all of their attention is directed inside. And so you can do simple refocusing techniques, like something we call the look, point, name. Have them look at something, point to it, and then name it, which is a simple thing. But a far more profound approach is to get them invested in something other than themselves. A few years ago, I saw a doctor who was moderately depressed, reason for his depression was twofold. One is he hadn't gotten a promotion that he expected, and the second thing was that his wife had just decided to go to work, and he wasn't getting as much support from her, and he started to think maybe she didn't care for him so much. And so he's seeing the patients, and he says, "This is just humdrum. It's just a routine thing. I'm like on an assembly line." And then I said, "I want you to focus on each patient that you see, and put down whether you're getting pleasure or sense of mastery from each patient." And he said, "Well, what's the sense of doing that?" And I said, "Well, look, there are reasons why you wanted to become a doctor." And he said, "What were the reasons for it?" He said, "Because I like to help people." So I said, "Okay." So then when you're seeing your patients, ask yourself each time whether you think you're helping the patient or not. So what I did is I got him reinvested in something that had at one time been significant to him, but had been flooded over by his depression. So the way to break through this tidal wave, as it were, was to get him again invested in something outside of the tidal wave, and that's what did it. So there are a whole lot of other methods that you can use, but it's based on the formulation. So while the first thing that I did when I made my sea change to cognitive therapy was to think in terms of the thought records and looking for alternative explanations. Still a very powerful technique, but it's by far not the only technique, and there are a whole variety of other things. And with experience, you get a sense as to what's most likely to work with a given patient.
And so with severely depressed patients, it may have been true of this study, I'm not sure. If you are trying to do cognitive restructuring with a severely depressed patient, you're not doing good cognitive therapy. You need to be doing the behavioral activation.
Right. And behavioral activation is a form of cognitive restructuring, because these people, as that patient I described to you, believed that he wasn't be able to be mobile again. And so by doing things, they get a real physical sense of being mobile, being able to be in control of their own body, as it were. And this has a very powerful reversal effect.
Good evening. My name is James Alsop. I'm Chief Justice of the Federal Court, and I'd like to welcome you all to tonight.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. And thank you for inviting me today, Mark and Richard. Can we put up the Prezi? That would be great. Okay, I'm going to talk this evening about some varying aspects of psychological well-being, but it's going to be a very rapid run-through of some variables that influence people's health. We're going to focus on individuals a bit, so things, and this links to some of the things that Mark does and Action for Happiness does, around what improves individual well-being, what improves individual resilience. But we're also going to address this concept of teams, and you can really look at this as being individual, family, community. And I'm going to share with you some of the concepts around social interaction that are incredibly potent in improving our health and our well-being. But we'll start with some individual stuff. And I'd like to just start with a very brief story. This was a metaphor that a chap called Zola, who was a medical sociologist, described back in the 70s. And he talked about a man walking through some woods, and he comes into a clearing. And at the edge of the clearing, there's a stream, and he starts to walk down the edge of the stream. And as he walks down the bank, he notices in the distance a man pulling what appears to be bodies out of the river. And as he gets closer, he observes this man, and he goes up to him and says, you know, what are you doing? And this man says, I'm rescuing these people. He's pulling these people out of the water. He's giving them mouth-to-mouth and cardiac resuscitation, and they're staggering off into the distance. And the passerby says, this is fantastic. You're really helping people. And he says, well, I'm a doctor, and I am helping them. But I'm so busy pulling bodies out of the river, I haven't got time to go upstream to see who's pushing them in. Now, I think this is a nice metaphor for medicine. When I went through medical school 30-plus years ago, we focused very much on disease. So we saw people who had often end-stage or terminal illness or serious chronic illness, but we didn't pay much attention to people who were well. I think medicine's shifted. We've now moved upstream. So we now look at risk factors and protective factors. And there are some very real risk factors for heart disease, for diabetes, for metabolic syndromes. And if you modify risk factors and increase protective factors, you can make a huge impact on the trajectory of an illness. And you can see this with heart disease and diabetes, and it's a fantastic advance. So we're not any longer waiting for people to get ill. Now, in psychiatry and psychology, we still waited for people to get ill, until actually Martin Seligman and one or two others actually started to look at positive psychology. There were rafts and rafts of data on illness and why people became mentally unwell, but there was very little research on what kept people well, what made people healthy, or kept people healthier, or allowed them to bounce back a bit quicker if they did face adversity. And I think this is a really exciting concept, and I think it's raised some really important issues about what are the risk factors for developing psychological problems, and what are the protective factors. Now, I was reading a paper recently on young people, and if you look at things like self-critical, self-recriminating, self-deprecating thinking, and rumination, which means going over and over something that's negative, that has the potency to create mood disorders in young people. And actually, most of the adult psychological problems that you see have their genesis in the first 20 or 25 years of life. And we're going to talk about a couple of areas that I think start to explain why this is so important. So one area is epigenetics. And how many people have heard of epigenetics? Just pop your hands up. Oh, lots of you. Gosh, fantastic. Because I often talk about epigenetics and people look rather vague, but that's fantastic, a massive number. Okay, well, this is, I think, changing the face of medicine, but it's also certainly changing the face of psychology. Because actually all sorts of everyday experiences switch your genes on and off. So the old concept, again, that I was taught in medical school is you have your genome, which is, half from your mum, half from your dad, and that's it. And it sort of tells your cells what to do. Well, actually, that's not true. You can switch genes on and off, and this is known as an epigenetic process. You can methylate, which switches them off. You can acetylate, which switches them on, and they send different messages into the cells. Now, this has huge importance because things like exercise have an epigenetic effect. So if you're a woman and you exercise regularly, 90 minutes a week, you halve your incidence of breast cancer. That is epigenetic. If you're a man or a woman and you exercise for 90 minutes a week, you actually halve your incidence of colonic cancer. These are epigenetic processes, and it's a fascinating area, but your emotional state has an epigenetic effect. Your cognitive style